Hello, hello. Welcome to Discord Q&A number 35, and let's get in there. Starting out, we've got why use percent current HP damage instead of percent max HP damage. So this one is one where I think it's actually easier to understand this if you ask yourself why use missing health damage and then flip that around, right? Missing health damage has a very clear purpose, which is finishing your opponent off. A really interesting case study or example case here is Elise, right? Her human form Q has current health damage on it, and her spider form Q has missing health damage on it, right? You can very clearly see the pattern of like what Elise is supposed to do, how she's supposed to approach fights, how she's rewarded for approaching fights, where, oh, of course, I'm supposed to use my human Q first and my spider Q last, because all of my other damage abilities will make my human Q do less damage and make my spider Q do more damage, right? And so in the ideal situation with Elise, in your full damage combo, you get max value out of the current health on your human Q by starting the fight with it, and you get max value on your spider Q by ending the fight with it, or like getting to the target with it and then attacking them. Right? Obviously, there's a dash attached to it, so it's not like a perfect example case here. But I think Elise human Q is a really good example of, hey, we want Elise to be able to deal some damage from range. Now, obviously, we've nerfed human Q a lot. I do think that the damage it deals is probably like below the satisfaction bar of what we'd like in an ideal world. And so I think it would be nice if we could buff it. Just whether that's the base damage or the current health damage is not that important to me. I just think it doesn't do that much damage. It's not that satisfying of a spell. But shape wise, I think it makes a lot of sense. A spell that actually I think works and does like pretty chunky damage in this way, I think that's useful for a good example case is actually Mundo Q. Mundo's Cleaver does very, 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 very high amounts of current health damage, right? And you can see how this influences his pattern and changes the way that he fights and the way that his pattern actually manifests, because it's a high amount of current health damage with a minimum on Mundo Cleaver, right? And what this does is it says, even when Mundo is not planning on interacting with you afterwards, with the slow on his Q, uh, him hitting a cleaver is still good for him against, random, like most random enemies, right? It's still exciting for him to play the cleaver minigame, even though it costs him health to throw cleavers. It's still an exciting and high tension minigame for the Mundo, and especially if you're in a lane, your lane opponent, but also even if you're outside of a lane, like Mundo and whoever he's interacting with, to play this cleaver minigame, even if both players know that Mundo is not going to try to run at them afterwards using the slow, right? There's still a lot of tension and danger and interest in the cleaver moment that, like for Mundo, right? uh, and for the opponent. Uh, but by having a lot of current health damage on it, one of the properties of Mundo's Cleaver, like having a just linear skill shot like that on a melee champion that just runs at you in a straight line, is you're pretty much always going to hit your Cleaver when you're standing on top of someone, right? Like the hit rate of the Cleaver goes up significantly as you get closer and closer to the target. And one of the dangers of that is if you have a high damage skill shot, that just means you have a lot more DPS when you're in close range, right? It just gives you a lot more burst. And one of the reasons why I really like the current health damage is it means that Mundo has to finish people off with his auto attacks, and his auto attacks have to be a really important part of his method of killing people, right? You can't just cleaver, 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 and then someone dies, right? The cleaver starts becoming less and less value, and the value proposition of the damage relative to the slow on hitting a cleaver becomes more and more weighted towards the slow as the person gets lower, right? And so hitting people with a cleaver, when you're meleeing them, is still really valuable because it slows them, but it doesn't have to do a lot of damage, and that means we get to put more damage into Muno's auto attacks or into his durability, because he does a lot of current health damage, which means he can still be threatening at range against higher health targets, which is desirable because it increases the interest in the cleaver minigame. But it means that the cleaver doesn't have to be really, really, really powerful when he's beating you to death with his fists, and he's on top of you, right? In general, something I'll say is that I actually think we should use current health damage on champions more. I think there's actually a lot of like tank patterns that could benefit from having something like Mundo Cleaver, where there's like a mini game or an effect with some interest, that doesn't have to be good at killing people. As an example, something like Maokai's Sapling, I could definitely see being something that would be interesting to have current health damage on it. Like essentially anything that's like long range or uh, a minigame or skill shot effect that's supposed to have some interest for a like melee-ish champion that we don't want to be dealing high amounts of damage overall, like over the course of like a 100-0 fight, or something that we don't generally want to actually be finishing people off. I think current health damage is a mechanic that probably should be leveraged more in League, and something that I wouldn't be surprised if you saw more over the course of the next, like, I don't know, 5 years, because ultimately current health damage, um, it's a little bit weird to think about, but I think the actual like end effects of it being on kits, especially when we use it correctly, work really, really, really well. Blade of the Ruin King is another example where Blade of the Ruin King, the original shape, well, the original version didn't have nearly as much current health damage, I guess I will say, but the intended shape of Blade of the Ruin King, like the reason why it has current health damage on it, is because it's intended to be for champions that are fighting people from full to zero, and specifically leading with their auto attacks is part of the value, right? And so champions that deal a lot of upfront damage with spells and then attack you afterwards get less value from Bork, and that's intended, right? That's by design. Um, Something I will say is that we've had various different versions of Bork that have different amounts of power in the stats versus the on hit. We've shifted, the most current version, the one we have in the game right now, has shifted some of the power out of the on hit relative to the stats. Right, the stats are a bit better than it was in its previous, the last few iterations, and the on hit is a little bit less powerful, and that's by design. Right, we felt that that went too far, but the goal is that, like, hey, if you're a champion that uses a bunch of spells to engage and then attacks them afterwards, that actually, it like gives you a reason to buy Kraken rather than Bork in our current structure, which I'm not saying is like amazing or anything like that, but that's one of the things we use to differentiate Bork and Kraken, which I think are not well differentiated enough, but that is one of the things that we're using to differentiate them, as the two sort of primary first item on hit items. And so sometimes it actually isn't even just, oh, the combat pattern is particularly amazing, but it's like, well, it serves as a relative foil to other items, or other effects in the system, which is sort of what Elise Q is doing, right? It's like it's sort of a foil to the human Q versus the spider Q. Anyway, hopefully that's a useful rundown of that. Why does Blitz still self-slow himself? So, fun fact about this, this isn't directly related to this question, but it's an interesting fun fact. A lot of people think of this as, oh, this is this mechanic that was added to Blitzcrank in like season 3 or whatever. I don't remember when it was actually added, season 4 or whatever. It's actually not a like new like add-on mechanic. It's actually an original mechanic that was on Blitz's kit. It was removed at one point, I think in like season 1 or season 2, then it was re-added later. But this is actually an original mechanic from his kit, which I think a lot of people don't actually know, that this is the OG version of the W that self-slows you after the effect ends. Not really super relevant to the question, just thought it was kind of interesting that a lot of people don't know that. Anyway, this is something where I'm kind of ambivalent on this a bit as a designer. I look at this and I say, well, I think it's somewhat thematic, right? And as a designer that's worked a lot on balance, one of the values of having a mechanic like this allows Blitzcrank to be more powerful in the moments that we want him to be powerful, right? Because he has a downside, right? It's like literally, this is a negative mechanic attached to your W. It means that we get to put power elsewhere. This means that, like, as an example, we have more power budget to say your W goes faster initially, or your Q has a lower cooldown, or does more damage, or you have more health, or your passive, it blocks more damage, or your R does more damage, or your R silences for longer, or whatever, right? There's a lot of places we can put power budget, and the question I have is not necessarily like, is self-slowing good or not, right? It's like, it's just, do we have another place we can put power that's actually more satisfaction up than the self-slow is satisfaction down? Because I think there's actually something cool about the self-slow of like calling your shot and saying, I'm going to speed myself up and I'm going to take my shot. I'm going to, go for the hook in this moment, and afterwards I'm putting myself at risk. Right? I think there's actually something interesting about the risk versus reward that the W is presenting you with. And the fact that this means that Blitzcrank can have a reasonably powerful movement speed steroid that's not specifically good at just speeding him around the map, because the self slow means that it's not a crazy amount of distance positive over the course of the entire duration of the effect, including the slow. But it does mean that Blitzcrank gets to W forward and then make a quick play like in that moment with a lot of movement speed, even though he'll be slowed afterwards, right? There is a really interesting version of Blitzcrank W that we tested a long time ago that I thought was really cool, uh, which was Blitzcrank could activate the W more times. I think the version that we tested was 3 times. The first, W1 essentially was like less movement speed, didn't self slow you. W2 was more movement speed, and it did self slow you like a lot more than live. And then W3 was, wow, you're going crazy fast, but you actually stunned yourself afterwards. There was something really cool about that, but it was also really weird, and like very finicky, and a lot of people don't want that kind of thing on Blitzcrank. Something to note, this is another thing where this is actually more related than the original story I was telling about this being an OG part of Blitzcrank's kit. But one thing you have to note about Blitzcrank that's pretty important here is Blitzcrank is one of our champions that we are very happy to be a high breadth, low depth champion. And one of the things that I'll say about this is if you're not familiar with those terms, I've explained them a lot in the past. I'll do the very brief explanation here, which is basically breadth is how many different types, like how many different players actually play the champion at all. And depth is how much does each individual person, like the average person who's playing this champion, play this champion. And so Blitzcrank is one of our few examples of a champion that we're very happy to be like very broadly played by a lot of different people, but not necessarily a champion that people play an enormous amount of. There are people that do, right? But that's not the typical experience, right? And one of the things we kind of ran into with other like more complex versions of the W was that it was very hostile to people just picking up and playing a game of Blitzcrank. It made him a lot less enjoyable to just like play one game of, where it was like, wow, I really screwed myself a couple of times with this W, and I would really have to put in a lot of effort in order to understand how you optimize this, and that makes him like less enjoyable to sort of pick up and play. And that's pretty important for the way that we position Blitzcrank, that he's like a really fun champion to just like play a single game of. You have a really good time, whether you win or lose. You're like, oh, I understand how the hook worked, and I understand what I was supposed to do, whether I succeeded or not. I understand that. It's not to say that Blitzcrank can't have depth. He absolutely can, and he does have some. But it's more about the relative value of uh, mechanics that are really hard to understand in your first game, or mechanics that let you really screw yourself long term by using them. Which there's something fun about them, but I don't necessarily know if that version was the right way of going about it. Anyway, I'm kind of spinning off on some of these less relevant tangents, let's say. Although I know there are some people who enjoy that, so you know, good for you if you do, I guess. Anyway, but sort of wrapping around to the actual question, like I said, I'm kind of ambivalent on like whether this is like an upside or downside. I think, to me, I think there's good value in, hey, this lets us put power budget in other places that are really cool and satisfying for Blitzcrank. um, it does feel bad to be self-slowed, of course, but uh, I kind of look at this and say, I don't think it's on its own worth removing. It's one of those things where if we were doing large scale changes to Blitzcrank, I think that it's something that we should, like reconsider, right? Like we should consider, like, is this mechanic good in our, updated newest version of Blitzcrank if we were doing big changes to him. But on a small scale, like as a buff, for example, I would, if you were like, snap your fingers, transport me onto the live pod, next week, and tell me I'm doing a 2% buff to Blitzcrank, I wouldn't really consider removing the self slow, even if I thought that it was exactly 2% and that would hit the magnitude, because it's kind of a shape change that I'm not confident is actually good for the champion in isolation. It might be, right? But it's something we have to test a lot, and I think on its own, it's probably not that likely to be a super satisfying like power up change comparatively to just putting that power elsewhere. Like, hey, you just get 10 more damage on your Q, or your Q is at 1 or 2 second lower cooldown, or your mana costs are lower, or whatever, right? Like something else that would very clearly be satisfying. Also, I don't know if you can hear the sirens. Sorry if you can. I'm probably gonna leave this in because I like this take. But anyway, sorry if that's hearable in this recording. Anyway, yeah, that's my thoughts on the Blitzcrank W self slow. So Janna pick rate lower than Zillion doesn't resonate. So I looked it up right before I answered this question, and it looks to me like the Janna pick rate is slightly higher than Zilean right now. But of course, it did look like in some of the previous patches that was not true. Do keep in mind, of course, when I'm answering these questions, some people ask about this from time to time, but a lot of these questions are from weeks or months ago because it just takes me a long time to get through the questions. There's way more questions than I have the time to answer. So keep in mind, if anything is asking about the current live state, sometimes the questions come in really, I get to answering them quite a bit later. Anyway, just generally talking about like Janna and Zilean pick rates here, something I'll note is that I think people have this perception of Janna as, oh, she's like one of those core supports that people play. And that really hasn't been true since like season 2, maybe 3, right? And one of the realities that I think people have a hard time grasping about Janna is that older versions of Janna that were a lot more popular existed in two sort of simultaneous like two things were simultaneously true that are no longer true. Number one is there were just way fewer supports, right? And especially way fewer really cool supports, right? And so if you were someone who got autofilled support in season 2 or season 3, there was a good chance that you were just going to pick Janna because she was a good support. You knew her, right? Like, you knew who she was. You saw her in your games, and you understood how you were going to be effective on Janna. But in today's world, right, like a lot of the people that might have picked Janna in the past would be way more excited to play like a Pike or a Thresh or a Rakan, right? We have way more like hype beast supports for the players that want that experience. And even if you want an enchanter, right, we have a lot of other champions that offer a more engaging lane experience or a more engaging experience in other ways that Janna doesn't offer, right? Like Nami, who is a much more aggressive support, or Lulu, who is much more aggressive, or even someone like a Soraka, who has more raw healing throughput and has a more well-defined, like clear loop in combat around her Q and W gameplay. Whereas Janna is like the peel support, right? And in previous versions of the game, there just weren't other options, right? Like if you were a support, a lot of it, like, and you wanted to play an enchanter, a lot of what you were doing was peeling, right? That was the only thing you could do. We've added a lot more options, a lot of other enchanters that do other things, or alternatively, a lot of other non-enchanters that do other exciting things in the support role. And so that clearly ate into Janna's pick rate because we split up a lot of the things that she used to do that she used to be just like either good enough at that it wasn't noticeable that like Lulu was better at being a lane bully or whatever. And now we have more extreme versions of Lulu like Nami who are like much more engaging and much more aggressive in lane. Or things that champions that just do other and gameplay fantasies entirely that are really exciting to some players. Also, related to this, supports get a lot more gold now, and so there's a lot of supports that are a lot more excited to engage with the item system than Janna. I think Janna's like okay with items. She's not as down on her items as like a Renata is, right? Like where Renata, you buy your items and you're like, these don't do anything, or like I don't care about any of these. But there's a lot of supports that are a lot more excited about some of the things they can get in the item system. Like say Seraphine, for example, where it's like, wow, these items are awesome for me, right? Like all like every item spike on Seraphine is actually quite exciting. Anyway, I've spun off a bit here. Let me talk about the second thing I think that has caused Janna's pick rate to decay a lot. And this one is one that I think a lot of people are going to have a hard time with, is that the Janna that you remember from season 2, season 3, season 1 was just wildly overpowered. This is something that I mention occasionally about some of these older champions, but just balance standards in the olden days were just not very tight. And there were a lot of champions that just sat at obscenely high levels of power for months or years, right? Champions like Rumble, champions like Janna, champions like Karthus. In the olden days, they just weren't really balanced by what we would consider to be like any semblance of modern balance standards. And so because of that, the Janna that people played in like season 2 was just winning a really unfair percentage of her games, right? And that is something where it wasn't really something that was immediately obvious to players that like, hey, Janna is winning a really unfair percentage of games. You should just pick her if you end up as support, right? This is before autofill. It's just like your last pick and you end up with support. You should probably pick like Janna or Sona. They're just they're like 55 or 56 on a lot of patches, right? Or even higher than that on some, right? And there is something to, I think, the idea of, yeah, some champions should probably sit at higher win rates for satisfaction purposes, but and even in the modern day we do that, but we have much tighter bands for that in the modern day than we do than we did in the past, right? Where in the past we said, well, Jenna doesn't feel that good, or Sona doesn't, so there's a lot of that. What I'm saying also applies to Sona, is like, hey, these champions don't feel that good unless they're really, really, really high win rate. And our answer to that more in the modern day is to say, well, we should give them more things to feel good about that don't require them to be substantially more powerful than other champions to feel just as good, right? Example of the opposite of this, by the way, is like some of our like really, really, really high skill skewed champions, right? Like, say like Akali, like some of the earlier versions of Akali, for example, they can actually feel really good at lower win rates, even if they're like factually not as powerful as other champions. Even when like high mastery, they can still feel really good because of some of the things that they're doing. They have a lot of really satisfying mechanics. I think Akali, previous iterations of the VGU Akali have had other problems, but anyway, I'm spinning off. I'm going to try and keep myself out of this discussion around Janna. Anyway, specifically comparing Janna to Zillion, people have this perception of Zillion as like, oh, the guy who never gets played, or like really, really, really low pick rate champion. It's not really true though, right? I think that the perception here is wrong on both ways. Of like, people wrongly perceive that Janna is this super popular champion. Like that's a legacy thing where, yeah, she used to not have very much competition, and she also used to be kind of overpowered. And people caught on to that and played her, and she was more satisfactory, or she was a more satisfying champion when she was really overpowered. Unsurprisingly, right? Being really overpowered makes you more fun to play for a lot of players. And Zillion people perceive as this champion who's never picked, but he actually has a pretty real pick rate, right? He's not like, he's very, very, very rarely been in like the bottom, 5 pick rate champions, as an example, right? He has a real pick rate. He is not like a popular champion by any means, but he is a champion who has a real dedicated player base that does exist, especially a lot of people that play him a lot, right? He's a higher depth champion. And so basically, what I'm getting at in total here is that I think that there's perception that is wrong on both ends. Of people perceive Janna as should be more popular than she is. I think she's actually at about like what I would consider to be about appropriate level of popularity for when she is balanced and when she's just the peels, like the peel enchanter, and there's other enchanters and other supports that do all of the other things better than her. And Zillion, I think, is more popular than people give him credit for, where he is a champion that people do really like to play around his E, especially like the WE loop and even the QW loop is really fun for some people. He is not a popular champion by any means, but he's more popular, I think, than people believe that he is, especially in certain regions where just generally the lower pick rate champions are more popular. Something that's also relevant to note here is certain regions have different levels of variance on pick rates of champions. NA, for example, traditionally has lower pick rates on the higher pick rate champions and higher pick rates on the lower pick rate champions. Essentially, the people in NA pick unpopular things more, and the popular things a little bit less than the other regions on average. Just something to note. Anyway, hopefully this covered the topic reasonably well. Yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Why did Iceborne Gauntlet lose its AoE Sheen effect when it was brought back? So we've had a lot of versions of Iceborne Gauntlet over the years. We had the OG version with mana. We had a few different versions in the Mythic system. We have this version, which I made. I'm not super thrilled with. I stripped some mechanics from the Mythic version and basically just sent it. And now it's not an item that I'm super thrilled about. I think it definitely could stand to get some improvements. But ultimately, a lot of this just came down to, at the time, when we were making a lot of the changes to this one, it was the intent of it not having AoE was to more clearly differentiate it from Sunfire, right? Where Sunfire at the time was supposed to be, this is the wave clear item, right? This is the item that helps you push. And when Iceborne had AoE on it, I think it was kind of muddy around like what item is supposed to help you push waves more. And this is one of the problems, actually, I think we run into a little bit today with Hollow Radiance. We actually currently are I think next patch is shipping some Sunfire buffs to make it better in PvP specifically, to give it more of a clear identity. But one of the problems that actually I caused by introducing Hollow Radiance is like actually this exact issue where you have two items that both do AoE damage, but one of them is clear, like one of them is clearly better, and then it's kind of like, okay, well then why would I buy the other one if I'm trying to do that thing? I think Iceborne has better differentiation in that it's a Sheen item, and there's some tie-ins to your kit there, and obviously it gives you a slow, which also has some kit tie-ins, and so it's less problematic in that way. I think the overlap between this and other fighter items. However, one of the things I'll also note is that something that's awkward about wave clear in the tank space is that we've shifted over time. A lot of tanks don't really need wave clear anymore, right? As an example, we've made Cho'Gath's E and Q more powerful over time, and so he doesn't really need to buy an item that helps him wave clear, right? And in general, there are the champions that need wave clear, like the tanks that need wave clear, especially like Shen, for example, already have great options, right? He can buy a Sunfire, he can buy a Hollow Radiance, he can buy a Titanic Hydra. He's got lots of options to help him push a wave. And the main value of the AoE Sheen effect when it was in the game was helping you push a wave. Now, sure, you could make an argument that like, well, it's a Sheen item and it's very different, but I question, is that where the power should go? I will agree with you that it's somewhat satisfying, right? It's like something whenever I do play Iceborne, which of course is rare on live these days, but whenever I play it, I'm like, in the moment when I Sheen something, I kind of wish that it AoE damaged enemies. But when I think about that as a designer, I'm like, well, where are we pulling power? And like, is this something that we could just give it on it like in isolation? It's a lot of power to have your Sheen effect be AoE, right? Especially considering the AoE on Iceborne is pretty decently sized, right? And I'm not saying the answer is oh, that's just bad, right? Like it's just wrong, right? It could be that there's a really good version of AoE Iceborne out there. Like I said, I don't think the current version of the item is particularly good, but I think we need to do more reconsidering of like, what is the stat profile of this item? What does it cost? Who are the users supposed to be? Like who should be buying the item and what do they need it for? The conclusion could be, actually, we want Cassante to have really good wave clear at one item, and therefore we're gonna make Iceborne Gauntlet AoE and then give this other properties. We're gonna really armor skew this item for Cassante, and then we're going to get these other 2 or 3 users or whatever, right? Maybe that's a really good version of Iceborne. I don't know. I do think it could stand to get some changes. I think the build path could be different. I think the stats it has could be different. I think the effect could be tuned differently. I want to be 100% clear. I'm not happy with the current state of the item. I am not confident that AoE Sheen is the right way of going about it. It could be actually, hey, this is the tank dueling item, and therefore it's supposed to be about dealing PvP damage. And in that world, we probably don't want it to have AoE damage. And I think a lot of this is just the question of what is the item supposed to do? Because I think it's lost lost a clear sense of identity of like this item does exactly A and B for champions X, Y, and Z. Now it's kind of like, well, it's an item I guess you can kind of buy on Cassante and Alawi in the current game, and it slows people, which is useful for you. But it doesn't really do too much else, and they're not really. I don't think either of those champions are super hyped up or excited to buy the item, and so I guess my ultimate answer to this question is, we're trying to tune it away from wave clear at the time, to make it more clearly differentiated from Sunfire when we brought it back. However, I could see there being a version of it with the AoE that we'd be happy with if we wanted it to be good at shoving waves, or we wanted it to be good for some other purpose that required the AoE. But this is one of those items where I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some, even mild to moderate changes, but could also be significant changes to it in the future, just because it's pretty clearly not really working right now, as a particularly compelling item in our systems. So it definitely could be better. With the advent of Fearless, why keep champs pro-jailed? So I think there's a couple of things going on here. One being that I think a lot of people's perception of what it means to be pro-jailed is not really correct, right? We have very few champions that are what I would consider to be pro-jailed on live right now. There are champions with low win rates on live right now, but in most cases, what that actually means is, well, they have an insane mastery curve, and if you play 30 games, you will actually be quite good. Or again, if you play 50 games, you'll actually be winning quite a lot of games, right? Like Rengar, for example, on live right now, his win rate is not that high, but his win rate is being dragged down quite a bit. I'm not saying people are saying Rengar is pro-jailed. I'm just using it as an example here. But Rengar's win rate is actually dragged down by inexperienced players playing him, right? Azir, I think, is an example of a champion that is actually pro-jailed. And the answer is ultimately that we've made the decision that, hey, despite the fact that these champions only like these champions that are extremely powerful in pro uh, are only present in gameplay in one game in pro at max because of fearless, like per series. Uh, we still believe that the game is a better experience and that it is worth uh, doing changes and suppressing these champions to some degree for pro. I think that's a debate. Like, there's a debate around like how much should we suppress them. Like, there's lots of open questions, right? I'm not saying this is like, oh, we have a definitive answer and it must be exactly what we do today because of this, right? It's like there's some threshold around pro binding that we've determined. Like, hey, if this champion is just getting banned for an entire 5 game series and pros never even play the champion one time and it's just a tax on red side's bans, we probably should do something about that, right? Um, and ultimately, there's less pro jailing because of Fearless, but it is not like the expectation when we did Fearless was never there will be no pro balance at all. We'll let the champions just completely roam free and decimate the pro experience, right? And generally speaking, we've made a call that we believe that it is worth tuning pro. We tune for pro significantly less post Fearless than we did before, but we still consider it to be one of our balance bands. If you've never heard me talk about this before, I've said this multiple times, but if you want to hear about more about the overarching balance strategy, look up League Dev Blog Oracle Framework or League Dev Blog Balance Framework, and there's some posts that have been made about this in the past. I'm not going to get super in depth on this, but uh, things have changed over the years, but the general structure is still correct, where we consider pro to be one of the 4 brackets that we tune around, especially on pro patches like the MSI patch or the Worlds patch or whatever. And so, in general, we believe that it is still worth tuning champions around pro just to a significantly lesser degree than we did pre Fearless, because the harm that a champion does to pro when they are not tuned perfectly for pro is much lower in a fearless world than it is in a pre-fearless world, essentially. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's just I'm not an expert on this topic. And I think there's a lot you can do just reading through some of the older dev blogs. But in general, we still believe that it is worth tuning champions to around pro just to a lesser degree than what we did before. What are your thoughts in regards to League Classic itemization, which is largely like mostly Season 3 itemization? And this person was specifically asking, are there areas where Classic is better? And the danger of asking me an open-ended question like this is that I can just say whatever I want and you can't stop me. I'm just going to kind of ramble on here about the like classic itemization, some of the differences and some of the things that I think are good, some of the things I think we could, maybe port forwards and do. I think the number one thing, in my personal opinion, that I think is actually better about classic itemization is cost differentiation. Right? There's a lot of items that cost weird amounts, like very high amounts of gold. Like I shouldn't say a lot. There's items that cost a very high amount of gold. There's items that cost a lot less gold, and there's better cost differentiation. One of the holdovers that I think we still have from the Mythic system that I've tried to break up, but I don't think I've done a super great job at this over the years. And I think I could, this is something that I or other people could do better, is trying to break up item spikes, especially first item spikes, right? In the Mythic world, pretty much everything had to be around 3,000 gold, because if your Mythic was significantly differentiated in cost than the other Mythics, that led to some really bad outcomes when we tried that. And so we sort of gravitated, we compressed them all down to around 3,000 gold. And there was very little variance there. One of the reasons why I made Rod of Ages very cheap when I did the demythicing in Season 14, as an example, was, hey, this is one of the items that can very clearly serve as a foil spike, like a very different timing spike to other items. It offers this faster, cheaper spike, but you have to wait 10 minutes to get the full power out of the item, right? But you get a power spike when you finish it. Well, especially on the original version. I guess we've nerfed it a little bit, so that's less true now. But that was the goal around making some of these items, like some of the items that I changed the cost of quite a bit, right? Like when I did Rod of Ages or Proto Belt, and I was like, hey, these are intended to be first items that have very different costs, and that means that people spike at different times. Again, I think this is particularly important for first items, where there being a lot of different times that people can spike, I think adds a lot of interest and texture to the game around, hey, This Echo, for example, right? Like when Echo used to buy cheaper versions of Protobelt, right? This Echo has a really cheap spike. And it's not as good as your big expensive spike, which means when Echo is behind, he still has a spike to play around that he might get at the same time as your spike, or he might even get it earlier still because his item is so much cheaper, even if he's behind in mid lane or whatever. He's still going to have a cheap spike to play around, but it's going to be a lot less powerful than your, looted spike or whatever, item you're buying that's more expensive. His opponent is buying that's more expensive, and that offers a really interesting dynamic where it's like, okay, so if you're even, Echo has a very clear window to play around where his protobelt spike is better than your components that you're building towards your first item, whatever that is. If Echo is behind, he still gets a window to play with, but it's probably going to be really small. If he's really, really, really behind, he never gets this window, and I think that's fine, right? If you're sufficiently behind, stuff breaks. That's okay. And if he's really ahead, he has a spike to like a larger window to play around this spike, but you have a point where you can come back and you're like, okay, I finished my item. He hasn't finished his second item yet. I have a bigger spike, and now I can try and leverage my bigger spike to take fights against the Echo, even though he's ahead of me, right? And I think there's a lot of interesting gameplay that can happen when spikes occur at different times. Again, particularly on first item, because I think a lot of the interest in this happens in like the laning phase and the early skirmishes. In team fights, it's less like when you start getting to like 2 and 3 items, I think it's less important because people just get their economy differentiated so much like over time. It's like, well, that person has 5 kills and that person has 10, and that's a lot of gold difference. This person has 120 farm and that person has 170, and so like the prices of your items become less relevant than like the amount of economy that you have, right? The economy gets more and more deviant between players as the game goes on, essentially, right? Until it starts converging towards the end of the game. We don't need to get into all of that, though. Anyway, I think cost differentiation and there being a lot of different items that have differently costed spikes, especially in the first slot, is one of the areas where Classic is, I think, a little better than League. Now, of course, Classic has some weirdo items that just like aren't very good, at weird prices, right? Like they have the super cheapo, like 2,200 gold Morello, for example, which I don't think is a particularly good example. Like I think Classic's individual item designs are generally worse, but I think the cost differentiation is overall better. Um, and this is a case where, like, another example. I guess I'll give one more example case, and then I'll move on. But another example is like I tried to make Essence Reaver a cheaper item when I made the Sheen version of Essence Reaver, but it turned out it was so powerful that we had to make it more expensive, which I'm kind of sad about. I wonder there's something I wonder about where it's like, oh, could I try and shrink Essence Reaver a bit to give the caster ADCs a cheaper, like a little bit less powerful spike on first item that's a little more exciting. It's tough because it gives so much mana, like it gives so much mana sustain. That's kind of like game warping, so that's a little bit difficult. But anyway, cost differentiation I think is the number one thing when I look at Classic. I say like, oh yeah, that's something that I think could be really interesting. I do think looking at some of the other areas on League Classic itemization around uh more sharp spikes. I think some classes could maybe benefit a little bit from that, right? Like IE is just a bigger spike, as an example, right? And I do think that mages and AD carries have lost a little bit over the years as their like big capstone multipliers have had their power traded off for power in other areas. That's one I think is more difficult to go back on. Like the cost differentiation stuff, I actually think would not be super difficult to do. Um, but the multiplier thing is more difficult because, like as an example, one of the reasons why AD carries have such an insane multiplier on Infinity Edge is that their first items are all bad, right? One of the reasons why mages can have a really insanely powerful death cap is that they don't really have very many good items to buy, right? Like your slots are actually constrained. It's like, well, you have a mana item, and then uh that's it, right? Like there's no Shadow Flame equivalent, right? There's no Storm Surge. They have Leandries, but it's a very different, Leandries, right? And so uh, there's a lot going on there where there's a lot of the things that make those spikes like exciting is a lack of features that we have today that I'm like not confident it would be better. But if we could find a way to maintain some of those features and still have those really really monstrous like big feeling like powerful feeling spikes in the same way that Classic does, I think that could be interesting for some classes. I do think there are some classes that like very clearly do not want that, right? Like fighters, for example, do not want to have like one item that turbo spikes them. They want to have smooth progression, smooth build paths, and that's something that Classic is just entirely lacking in. Like they just don't have fighter itemization really. Anyway, Uh, Individual items, I generally have a pretty low opinion of the item, like the items that are in classic. I don't think that's going to be a surprise, right? Like I think that most of the items that they have are fairly like that are meaningfully different from the ones that we have today, are just generally low quality items or have like deep systemic issues of some kind, right? Like as an example, I've talked about this a little bit before, but I'll just sort of rehash one of these. It's like the aura items that they have. I think Woda is probably the best one that they have, but I generally just think the aura items, like the passive aura items, are just kind of low quality, right? Like I think that there's room for there to be cool auras, but I think that they should have like little gameplay hooks and be a little more exciting, right? Like Bandle Pipes is an item that really overperformed my expectations as an example, and I think that if we were making aura items today, we should use Bandle Pipes as the template, right? Not Woda as an example. Even though I think Woda is like maybe the best aura item of the ones that are in Classic, right? Like the locket, the defensive aura, I personally find to be like pretty abhorrent because it is a mandatory item for your team to be able to team fight at all, because it's defensive. Like the defensive auras, I think are just generally like kind of, I'm not a fan of those on the item system because they like warp the item system in ways that are not great. Where it it becomes mandatory for one person to basically curse their inventory by uh, being forced to slot this item in. Don't need to get into all of that. Something I've talked about a little bit before. I forget what video it was. I think it was like, I don't know, 31 or something. You look it up in the table of contents. Shout out to the table of contents in my Discord, by the way. If you're looking for a previous question I've answered, you can look them up there. Anyway, but anyway, I think I've rambled on about this. Let me think if there's any other things that I could ramble on about classic itemization. There's like a lot of things that just I think are clearly worse, right? Like the crit numbers on items. I think it's nice to have like round numbers that smoothly go up to 100%, right? I think that's a better system. I think that actually AP is one. I think that AP, like not AP as a like AP obviously is the same in the old system and the new one. I think the way that AP manifests, where there's just higher raw AP numbers in the classic system than the modern one. This is something I tried to do in season 14, was just increase the overall amount of AP in the mage system and drain the other stats. And I was successful at doing that, right? I was able to lower the amount of HP and haste that mages were getting in order to give them higher amounts of raw AP. Um, Classic, I think the classic AP system, I think, does do a better job of just giving higher raw AP numbers, which I think feels really good and also helps you scale some of those random utility spells in your kit, like Oriana's E, for example. You just have more AP, so the shield just gets bigger over game time, which I really like. I think it's tough because we depowered the item system in 14-19 after I shipped my season 14 changes, and where a lot of that power had to come from in the AP system was draining a bit of the AP away, which I'm a little sad about. That's one of the cases where I've talked about this before, but I think we could probably find other ways of accomplishing the same goals, and maybe get a little bit more AP value back in the AP system. I would like to be able to find ways to do that in the future, and that's something where I think Classic does just offer higher raw AP values and then less like other multipliers to your damage or fewer other utility stats. And the League Classic itemization is in some ways just more powerful than our modern ones. They have more power budget to spend, which is part of where that AP comes from. But yeah, I think those are the sort of top things I think about when I think about League Classic itemization. I don't like have any specific item callouts of like, oh, the this exact version of the League Classics Leandries or League Classics Easy Rod or whatever, right? It's like those stuff's like I'm generally like kind of the opinion that's like, yep, all of the logic that we had for like reworking or removing a lot of the items that they have in Classic, I think still holds up today. And so individual items I'm less compelled by, generally speaking. But yeah, I guess that's my total thoughts. So that's my sort of ramble on Classic itemization compared to today's. What's the reason behind making only one side of Thresh box deal damage? So this was a nerf that was done to Thresh where the box was supposed to deal high damage to give you the satisfaction of breaking the wall, right? Or like as the Thresh player, seeing someone break the wall, especially if you like flay them into it, you see that big damage chunk and you get the satisfaction of that. However, the 99% slow ends up carrying a lot of satisfaction anyway, and we were always looking for ways to trim power from Thresh that would not be things that Thresh players would care that much about, or like not be super feelable for the Thresh player, right? This is two examples that come to my mind are the W shield only affects one other person now instead of being able to shield your entire team. And the R, like the box, the one we're talking about here, is the box only damages one target. These were ways we could basically siphon power away from Thresh that wasn't something that the Thresh players cared that much about. It's the kind of thing where uh, when we had the choice between, we could just nerf the damage on the box, like the Thresh R, by, say 30% or whatever, right? I don't know what the right number would be. Or make it only affect one target, like with the first wall being the only one to deal damage. And I think it's pretty clear to me that like the more satisfying version is only the first wall deals damage, because then when the first person breaks the wall, you, as the Thresh player, you get to see that big chunky damage and say like, oh yeah, that's cool, I did that, right? Or you flay them into it, or you hook them into it, or whatever. And the comparison point here is the Thresh doesn't have a lot of control over breaking multiple walls. It's pretty rare as the Thresh that you have direct control over. That's more of a situational thing of like, well, your opponents just walk through it. And you still get the satisfaction of the slow from those cases. And so ultimately, I think this is just one of those changes where I kind of look at it and I say, was it the only thing we could have done to solve this problem? No. Was it a good way of addressing like, hey, we need to nerf Thresh, but we want him to still be as satisfying as possible? Yeah, I think that was a good way of approaching it, where we depowered the box a little bit, but we still kept a lot of the things about the box that were really compelling and satisfying for the Thresh players. And in general, I'm pretty happy with this change overall. Just straight up. Why is the support quest reward a control ward discount instead of free control wards? So there's a few reasons. One thing I want to be clear about is we actually tested this pretty extensively. In fact, I'm actually pretty sure, not 100% sure, but I'm like 90% sure we spent more time testing free control wards than we spent testing control ward discounts on the support quest when we were making role quests last year. But we ran into a few issues. So there's a couple of different cooldown models we can use for free control wards, right? One of them, as an example, is you get the free control ward when you base, similarly to how the support item works, the Sightstone equivalent, where you just get wards when you base, right? If we do that version, that heavily buffs and encourages the spam base support style of like, you run at a base, you drop your wards, and then you base to get your wards back, and you just keep repeating doing that over and over and over and over again, right? We didn't really want to make that more powerful or something that we were encouraging more. And so that model seemed like kind of pretty immediately after trying it a couple of games, something we didn't want to do. So we tried another model for a bit, which was you get them on a cooldown. That led to some really weird optimizations, though, around like, oh, I'm low HP, or I should really base and set up for this next objective, but it's not clear whether I should stay on the map and wait for this control ward, or whether I should base and refresh my regular wards. It created some weird competing incentives for support players around what they were supposed to be doing when it had a cooldown. So there's a lot of weirdness around it. It's not the kind of thing where it's like, I think it would have been like game-breakingly awful or anything like that. It was just, it wasn't great. And it led to some weird, confusing, like optimizations around like when you were supposed to base versus when you were supposed to stay on the map. And so that version, I think we came to the conclusion was like, it's just too weird. And if you're thinking, by the way, like, oh, why don't you just make them free in base? That's basically the same thing as the, like you just get them for free. You just get them in your inventory when you base. Anyway, there was another thing that we ran into also, which was, giving the control wards for free also meant that you got an even distribution of them over the game, which is also a little bit weird, right? There are situations where you want to like buy like multiple pinks, and you want to have them in your inventory and be able to like rapidly like essentially have extra sweeping value and extra control over like the Baron area, for example. And the cooldown model didn't really play nicely with that, where players who cared a lot about that kind of vision control would say, well, I'm just going to buy 2 pinks anyway. I don't care about your cooldown model, or I don't care about what free pinks you're giving me. I'm always going to want 2 pinks for this situation. And there were also a lot of players who were like, well, if you don't care as much about the vision system as a support, and you don't want to engage with pinks as much, this thing is kind of forcing you to interact with control wards, even more so than you're already interacting with the vision system. Now, all of this having been said, personally, I'm not really a big fan of the discount either. I think it makes it actually too easy to just like constantly be spamming multiple pinks on the map and controlling large areas of vision as the support. I'm actually not a big fan of that. I think that the cost of that is in the current game is a little bit too low. But all of this having been said, our conclusions were we wanted supports to have something that was clearly tied into the vision system, and so we ended up doing the discount because it gives the support player more control over when that power is manifesting. And like it essentially says when you're in the phase of the game when you care a lot about the control wards, you can opt into that. And if you're a player who doesn't want to do that, you don't have to interact with that system. Whereas the version that's cooldown based essentially forces you to interact with that evenly over game time, which is awkward both for the support player that cares a lot about the vision system and for the support player that doesn't care that much about the vision system, because the support that cares a lot essentially ends up getting told, well, you still have to buy double pinks when you're about to do this crazy Baron setup anyway, and so it doesn't help you a lot of the time. And the support who doesn't care about the vision system is like, well, you have to interact with these pinks or you're wasting free value. Whereas it just being a discount, I think, mitigates or resolves most of those issues that we had. Again, though, I'm not personally a big fan of the discount. I think that we probably should do something else, like maybe upgrade your trinket or something like that, like make your trinket more powerful. I think would be an even cooler version of that, for a variety of reasons. We don't need to get into all of that, but that's my current thought on that is that I think the discount makes more sense than the free control wards, but I think there's probably something else out there that would be even better than the discount, that could tie into the vision system for supports that would be interesting or cool for them. Critical strikes from probability based to basic attack scalar multiplier. So this is something that I see suggested from time to time. It's not a super novel concept or revolutionary one where crit strikes in the current game, the math is actually pretty nice. Each 1% crit damage over a sufficiently large number of autos, or literally exactly if you have 100% or 0%, each 1% critical strike chance is essentially 1% more damage with your auto attacks, right? Because if you think about it, if you have 50% crit chance, half the time you your autos do 200% of your total AD instead of 100%. If you do the math out, that essentially means that your average auto attack is doing 150% of your AD, right? So essentially every 1% crit is 1% more ratio on your auto attack. That's how they work, right? And so it's not really a super crazy concept to say, oh, what if it was just you scale the ratio of your auto attack? Well, that's not actually the point of the crit system. I mean, it's one of the things the crit system does is it's a multiplier for AD carries and crit champions, right? That is part of the value of it, right? But part of the value is also variance, right? One of the core values of having crit is that most of our AD carries, especially our crit AD carries, don't actually have very good variance. And that's part of why this is actually tied into, I think, a question I might have added, or maybe not, I don't remember. Anyway, I've added a lot of questions today. But one of the things I think I'm going to be talking about later in some other Q&A is uh, a lot of the reason why AD carries, we tend to want to send them bot lane is that AD carry, especially crit AD carries, have most of their power tied into the basic attack, which is literally a targeted low, very, very, very low cooldown, high repeatability effect. There's not very much variance on auto attacks, right? There's very low variance on them. And what that means is that we need to find other ways of introducing variance. And when you have so much of your power budget loaded into the low variance auto attack, we tend to need to find other ways of introducing variance to your kit or to the situations that you're in. And one of the reasons why the bot lane 2v2 is a really good place for that is that you have two whole other champions that are going to introduce variance. Did your Blitzcrank hit the hook? Did the enemy Thresh flay both of you or just one of you? Did the Soraka hit Q? Did the Lulu shield the right target at the right time? Did the Janna use her E before she got her, hit her Q and W to get the cooldown refund on her E, etc. Right? There's a lot of variance that is added to the 2v2 through the supports. And there's a lot of variance that is added to crit champions through did you crit or not? And when did you crit? And when does that make you use your abilities differently? Now, I want to be clear here. I don't really love the way that crit introduces variance to our crit champions kits, right? Like, which is just pseudo random on your auto attacks do more or don't do more damage, right? I do like the fact that we eventually trend towards 100% crit, which removes the variance, and I do like the fact that their auto attacks scale over game time. But I want to be clear that, like, I am not saying this is the best version of the system, or like the best possible version of like an auto attack scaling system. However, it is important for our crit champions that we offer them some variance in their auto attacks, especially as they're building towards their items, and that means that there's some different things that can occur. Now, should that variance be, primarily based on RNG? Maybe not, right? But it is good to have higher variance effects where like Jinx can buy a hex optics first with 25% crit and see that really, really, really big number. That big number is really satisfying, right? And it's important that that number is not locked exclusively, like seeing the really big number that's really satisfying for the Jinx player or the Caitlyn player or whatever is not locked exclusively behind uh, getting to 100% crit, right? It's valuable that even earlier in the game, you can still have really satisfying moments of, wow, my auto attack did twice as much damage. That's really fun and cool for me. Now, again, I'm not saying that crit is necessarily the best system ever to do this, or that it's perfect, right? It's a system that people can understand very easily, and it does introduce that variance, as the 2v2 does to these champion kits that otherwise don't have very good variance, don't have like a whole lot of variance and difference in outcomes that they can have. But uh, it is a system that works, and it's the one that we have. If you told me, right, like if you snap your fingers, wave a magic wand, and I'm redesigning League of Legends from the ground up, I would probably start by saying we are going to do one of two things. Number one is we're going to start intentionally building our crit champions to have better in-kit variance on their damage, and therefore, that means that they don't need to be tied to the bot lane 2v2. They don't need to be tied to this crit system. Or we're going to keep the same low variance on their auto attacks and their damage that they have in the current version of League. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore other versions of what crit could be that still has some variance, that still lets you hit big number, see big number, but doesn't rely exclusively upon RNG to generate that variance. And to be clear, for people who are wondering about the RNG, League's RNG system is pseudo random, right? It's not it's not like, oh, I have a crit cloak in my inventory, I'm going to crit a champion 5 times back to back, right? There is some massaging of the system where on champions you actually have this effect where, hey, if you've crit recently, like if you've crit sort of like more than you're supposed to recently, you won't crit as much afterwards. If you've crit less, you will crit. You'll have more likelihood of crit. There's some smoothing there under the hood, such that this is not pure raw RNG. But in general, I would say crit is a solution to a problem that we have in the game, which is that crit AD carries do not have good variance. It is not our only mitigation to this problem, and it is not necessarily the best way of resolving this issue, in my opinion. But it is a thing that we have that does address this, and it's pretty good at it. It's not necessarily the best thing ever at it, but it's not bad. And therefore, I think crit is around to stay. It's a core part of League at this point, and I'm not saying that we would that we should or could ever change it from its current form. But that's my thoughts on the matter. How do you determine that a champion is worthy of jungle damage modifiers? And this person was talking about, like, why doesn't Rammus have one as an example? This one's actually a pretty easy question to answer. It's very straightforward. We give a champion jungle damage modifiers when we want them to clear the jungle faster. Something I will say as an example for Rammus is, like, I do think that Rammus's clear feels bad, and that therefore would justify us giving him a monster damage mod so that he could clear, like, feel less bad about his clear. But he is powerful, right? And that power would have to come from somewhere. And I think that the question is, okay, if we're giving him more clear speed, what is he trading off on? He's one of the best ganking champions in the entire game as a jungler, and he also scales. He's a useful tank later, in the later parts of the game as in team fights. So where are we going to drain power? Does that mean that he has to be less tanky? Does that mean that he has to be less good at ganking? Does that mean that he needs some other weakness, right? Like, I don't know what the answer to that is, right? But that's why Rammus, as an example, doesn't have a crazy jungle modifier to let him clear faster. Is that power would have to come from somewhere. And also, by the way, some champion has to be the jungler that clears the slowest in the game. I don't know if it's Rammus, but someone has to be that, right? I do personally think that Rammus's clear is probably below the bar of satisfaction. And so I think it would be nice if we could find a way to make his clear feel a little better. But in general, sort of answering this question in the general sense is, we give a champion jungle damage modifiers when we want them to clear faster. Related, one of the things that I've talked about a lot in previous Q&As and also on stream is that even if we give a champion a good clear, that doesn't make them a jungler innately, right? Zed is a really good example here, where Zed's clear to be a functional jungler had to be 10, 20 seconds faster than basically almost every other jungler in the game, right? Like, he was crazy speed. And that was the only thing that made him, like, barely functional. And that's not really being a jungler. That's just like, well, you just like you just do one part of being a jungler so much better than everyone else that that makes you powerful in the role without really doing any of the other things that like a jungler is expected or should be able to do, like gank a lane or control an objective fight or scrap people in the river or whatever, right? Insert all the other things that junglers do. And so that like that level of clear speed is so expectation breaking that I think we're unlikely to ever go back to doing things like that around like, well, we made this non-jungler a jungler by giving them an absolutely insano level of clear speed such that now they just clear way faster than all of the regular junglers, and that enables them to be more powerful. And that's where jungle damage modifiers come in, is like, well, hey, this champion that we want to be viable in the jungle is not quite good enough at clearing the jungle to be functional there. Malphite, I think, is a really good example of, hey, with just a bit of jungle damage modification, suddenly he became a viable, functional, and healthy jungler. Awesome. That's a really good use of jungle damage modifiers that doesn't affect his laning really at all. And now he's just a very solid, functional jungler that you can play. Great. That's a really good example of a great usage of a jungle modifier. And so it's less about, is a champion worthy, and more about like, well, having a jungle damage modifier gives you more clear speed. Do we want the champion to have more clear speed? Not too complex. AP damage to turrets. So this is something that has been, I've seen some people talking about this recently. I think it's worth bringing up and having a little bit of a talk about it, which is, for those of you not familiar, in Season 8, the AP ratio when you attack a turret was increased from 50% to 60%. And it's been that ever since. It is worth noting that at this point, we almost, we're getting close to the point where it's been 60% for almost as long as it was 50%. Season 8 was a long time ago. Anyway, talking this through, this was intended originally to make AD carries less necessary, where at the time it was believed a huge part of why you had to have an AD carry on your team was, well, they're the champions that are best at killing turrets. Something that's kind of interesting about this, though, is that AD carries, like, especially like, when you look at their builds, crits and on hits don't work on towers. And so one of the interesting things about this is that some of the primary stats that our DPS AD carries buy actually don't work on turrets at all. And something that I think is like worth thinking about is, was that philosophy ever really correct, right? Like, was it really true that AD carries were just too important for tower taking, and that was what made them useful? Because like, I'm kind of skeptical looking back today, and I'm someone who thought the same thing back in the day, but I'm kind of skeptical looking back with the information we have today that was actually ever true. I don't need to spin into that off topic, but in general, what I'll say is I could believe that a 55% AP ratio to turrets would be better for the game than 60%, and say, hey, AD champions get a bit more value, or maybe even take it back to 50%, right? However, I think there's also a discussion that probably should be had here around, are the turret, like the rules for hitting a turret, the right ones? As an example, if we actually wanted to make it so that AD carries are very clearly the best turret destroyers in the entire game, something that we could do is we could say, okay, snap our fingers, all turrets are 30% tankier, and you can crit turrets. And so now crit champions have a massive advantage against turrets. They're tankier, but the crit champions, as they build crit, get to deal more and more and more damage to turrets. Or alternately, like you can't crit turrets, but like your crit has some damage, multiplier on your damage turrets or whatever, right? I think that there's probably something to the idea of, hey, we haven't really deeply considered the rules around what it means for a champion to attack a turret and what should happen and like what those numbers should be. Basically, since Season 8, I don't think, at least I don't remember anyone really putting a lot of deep effort and thought into that. Like the most recent, I think, significant change to turrets was something that I was aggressively pitching years ago, which was, hey, it doesn't make sense that you only get either your bonus AD or your AP against turrets. This just means that champions that build both bonus AD and AP just deal less damage to turrets than everyone else for like no real value here. And so we changed that. And that's one example of like, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I was like, I literally couldn't come up with a reason why that would be correct. And so, I was able to make that argument successfully, and we changed it, right? And so ultimately, I think this is one of those cases where, yeah, I could believe that the AP ratio to turrets should be a little lower. I haven't super deeply like mapped this out. Like understanding what this means, I think would require doing a lot of like math around like item breakpoints and attack speed breakpoints and turret health and like how quickly turrets are destroyed and whether we think turrets are getting destroyed in the right amount of time, whether they have the correct amount of resistances, et cetera, right? And I could absolutely believe that something that would be useful and good for League of Legends is someone spending, a week deeply thinking about and mathing out like different situations and understanding like in the current game how good are different classes at taking turrets and what do we actually want different subclasses like how good do we want different subclasses to be at hitting turrets, right? Like should crit champions definitively be the best turret killers in the game, and if so, where are they today relative to like an average mage? Because I don't know what the difference is on live right now, and so it's hard for me to like give a reasonable statement about this. Like I could believe the AP ratio is too high, but if you told me, like if you did a bunch of math and told me, well, crit 80 carries currently deal 5% more turret DPS on average than the average mage, and then my question then would be like, is that the right number? Should it be 10%? Should it be 15%? Should they be faster? I think the answer is probably yeah. I think they probably should be a little bit better at DPSing turrets than mages, but I don't actually know what the difference is. And also, it could be that maybe at one item they're 5% faster, but at three items they're only 2% faster, or vice versa, right? Like there's just a lot of open questions here that I don't have the answers to. And so I can't give you an answer of like, do I think the AP ratio on turrets is the right number? But I do think that like my take, my stance, my take is that I think there probably would be a lot of value in someone doing a deep dive on these numbers and reevaluating whether the rules for dealing damage to turrets are correct in the first place. Like around like whether crit works on turrets or whether on hits like from items should work on turrets, et cetera, right? I think there's a lot of questions, like a lot of open questions there because this is just a system that we haven't really messed with significantly, aside from adding plates to the tower, which is not really considering like is the way that players interact with towers correct? That's just saying we're going to take the current system and make it slightly harder to take the towers and give you more gold over over the course of the entire turret and breakpoints, right? And so that we didn't really deeply consider that at that time either. And so I think there's some value that could be gained here by doing that evaluation. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching number 35, and hopefully catch you in number 36.